You learn pretty quick that out here in the high desert of Nevada, silence has a weight to it, a physical presence that sits on your chest. And when that silence breaks at the wrong hour, your body knows it's trouble long before your brain wakes up to process the threat. It was 5:14 in the morning, that dead gray time where the coyotes have stopped yipping but the sun hasn't quite crested the Ruby Mountains, and I was jolted awake not by a sound, but by the vibration of the perimeter alarm on my nightstand, 3 short pulses that told me someone wasn't just near my property, they were already inside the wire. My 2 German shepherds, Gunner and Rex, were already sitting up by the bed, statues made of muscle and fur, ears pricked forward in that terrifying way that says they aren't barking because they're hunting, waiting for the command to turn into kinetic energy. I grabbed my phone, tapping into the infrared camera feed covering the East Access Road, and what I saw made my blood turn into something cold and slow, moving through my veins like slush. A white cargo van, headlights killed, creeping up my private gravel drive with the slow, predatory patience of a thief who thinks the world is asleep. It wasn't a county vehicle, it wasn't a utility truck, and it sure as hell wasn't a guest. It was a generic Ford Transit with a magnetic decal slapped on the door that read Community Compliance Division, which is a fancy way of saying nobody, because the nearest homeowners association is miles down the highway in a subdivision called Canyon Creek Estates. I watched on the screen as 3 men stepped out near my machine shed, dressed in that bargain bin tactical gear you see on internet forums, mismatched vests, cargo pants tucked into unlaced boots, clipboards that were supposed to look official but just looked ridiculous in the pre-dawn gloom. One of them, a guy wearing sunglasses in the pitch black who I'll call Officer Trent, started pointing at my barn while another guy took pictures, and I felt that specific kind of rage that doesn't make you yell. It makes you quiet, focused, sharp. I didn't reach for the phone to call 911 because out here response time is measured in hours, not minutes. So I grabbed my shotgun, a beat-up but reliable Remington, racked a shell just to hear the mechanical reassurance of it, and walked out to the garage to fire up my diesel UTV. I didn't turn the headlights on until I was right on top of them, cresting the hill and flipping the switch, flooding the yard with blinding LED white light, freezing them like cockroaches caught in a kitchen pantry. I killed the engine, stepped out into the gravel with the shotgun rested easy in the crook of my arm, and let the silence stretch out for 10 painful seconds, just long enough for them to realize they weren't the predators here. "Morning, gentlemen," I said, my voice scratching against the cold air. "Unless you took a wrong turn on the way to the circus, I'm gonna need a real good reason why you're standing on deeded land before the sun is up." Trent, the guy with the clipboard, puffed his chest out, trying to summon some authority he clearly didn't possess, and said, "Sir, we are conducting a code violation audit for the Canyon Creek expansion project. Your perimeter fencing is non-compliant with the new aesthetic ordinances, and your livestock structures are visually obstructing the scenic easement." I almost laughed. Really, I almost did, because the audacity of telling a man his cattle fence doesn't match a subdivision he doesn't live in is a special kind of stupid. I told him, "Son, this is unincorporated land. Your little HOA rules don't cross that cattle guard. So I suggest you pack up your clipboard and your spirit Halloween costumes and roll out before I decide you're trespassing with intent." That's when things went sideways, because instead of leaving, the third guy, who had been skulking near the fence line, panicked when my dogs trotted into view, and he scrambled backward, tripping and slamming his heavy body right into the aging cedar posts of my nursing pen. There was a sickening snap of wood splintering, followed immediately by the terrified, high-pitched bleat of Bucky, my prize calf who was recovering from a sickness, and I watched in horror as the little guy bolted in fear, tangling his leg in the loose barbed wire, thrashing and screaming in pain as the metal barbs tore into his tendon. The sound of that calf crying out flipped a switch in my head, turning the cold calculation into a white-hot inferno, but I knew if I ran to the calf, these cowards would jump in their van and vanish, so I had to make a choice. I jumped back into the UTV, revved the diesel engine until it roared, and drove straight at their van, swinging the front end around and hooking my heavy-duty winch cable to their front axle before they could even process what was happening. Trent started screaming about kidnapping and lawsuits, but I ignored him, engaging the winch and dragging their vehicle backward, tires screeching against the dirt, pulling it 50 yards until I shoved the nose of that van right inside my open equipment barn. I hopped out, slammed the sliding iron doors shut, dropped the heavy locking bar into place, and turned back to them, pointing at the ground. "You aren't leaving," I said, my voice trembling now, not with fear, but with the effort of not doing something permanent. "That van is evidence of a crime, and you three are going to wait right here for the sheriff, while I go tend to the animal you just maimed." By the time Sheriff Miller arrived, the sun was up, painting the desert in deceptive golds and pinks, and I was on my knees in the dirt, hands covered in blood, trying to stabilize Bucky's leg while the three fake officers sat on the ground, handcuffed and looking small. Sheriff Miller, a man who's seen it all and is impressed by none of it, was taking my statement when a glistening, pristine black truck pulled up, a $90,000 monolith of chrome and ego, and out stepped Marcus Sterling. Sterling was the developer behind Canyon Creek, a man who wore suits that cost more than my truck and had a smile that didn't reach his dead, shark-like eyes. He walked right past me, straight to the sheriff, handing him a leather folio filled with documents that looked important, heavy with embossed seals. "Sheriff," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil, "these men are my employees operating under an emergency jurisdiction easement granted by the county. This man," he pointed a manicured finger at me, "has illegally detained them and seized corporate property." Miller looked at the papers, flipped through them for about 3 seconds, and handed them back with a look of pure disgust. "Marcus, these are drafted by your lawyers, not a judge. They aren't worth the paper they're printed on in my county, and your boys here caused property damage and injured livestock." Sterling's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian stare that he turned on me, stepping close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne trying to cover the scent of the desert. "You're making a mistake, Silas," he whispered, low enough so the sheriff wouldn't catch it. "You're in the way of progress, and I have more lawyers than you have fence posts, so you can either sell me this land now, or I will bury you in so much litigation and misery that you'll beg me to take it." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Get off my land." He left, but as he drove away, I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the opening shot of a war I hadn't asked for, but was damn sure going to finish. The thing about men like Marcus Sterling is that they don't know how to fight with their hands. They fight with fear, they fight with shadows, and they fight dirty because they think money buys them immunity from consequences. 2 nights after the incident, around 2 a.m., the air on the ranch felt thick, charged with that static electricity that screams danger, and I found myself standing on the porch, staring out into the pitch-black void of the desert, watching a single pair of parking lights hovering on the access road like the eyes of a demon. My phone buzzed in my pocket, not my regular phone, but the burner phone I had confiscated from Trent, the fake patrol leader, which I had kept locked in my safe. I answered it, saying nothing, just listening to the breathing on the other end until a voice, digitally distorted but unmistakable in its arrogance, hissed through the speaker. "You should check the perimeter, Silas. Accidents happen when people don't cooperate." The line went dead, and a cold pit opened in my stomach, the kind of dread that makes your knees weak, and I grabbed my flashlight and ran, not to the gate, but to the dog run where Gunner and Rex were pacing. I scanned the ground with the beam, heart hammering against my ribs, until the light caught something wet and glistening in the dust just inside the fence line. A raw steak, purple in the light, dusted with a bright blue powder that I recognized instantly from my days dealing with pests, strychnine. I fell to my knees, dry heaving, realizing that if I hadn't been awake, if I hadn't been vigilant, my boys would be dead, their lungs paralyzed while I slept. This wasn't a land dispute anymore. It wasn't about money or views or ordinances. This was an attempt on the lives of my family. And looking at that poisoned meat, I felt the last lingering restraint inside me snap like a dry twig. I didn't call the sheriff this time, because the law requires proof and warrants and time I didn't have. Instead, I called Jax, an old friend from the service who works as a private investigator in Reno, a man who specializes in finding the things that rich men try very hard to hide. I told him, "They tried to kill the dogs. Jax, I need you down here, and I need you to bring the war back." Jax arrived the next morning in his battered Jeep, looking like he hadn't slept in a week, but grinning like a kid on Christmas, carrying a laptop case and a box of files thick enough to stop a bullet. We sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid, while he laid out the puzzle pieces he'd been assembling since I first tipped him off about the fake patrol. "You're going to love this," Jack said, tapping a stack of spreadsheets. I started digging into Canyon Creek's financials, and Marcus Sterling isn't just a bully, he's a thief. He showed me the transfers. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved from the HOA reserve funds into a shell company called Apex Consulting, which, surprise, surprise, was registered to Sterling's brother-in-law. But the real smoking gun wasn't the money, it was the map. Jax pulled out a large topographic print, a GIS survey that looked official, but he pointed to the boundary line of my ranch. "This is the map they submitted to the County Planning Commission," he explained. "See this green zone? They labeled your entire property as future Phase 4 development and community open space, claiming they already had an option to buy, which allowed them to secure a massive loan from the bank." "He doesn't have an option to buy," I growled, staring at the lie printed in high-resolution ink. "I never signed a thing." "Exactly," Jack said, leaning back, "which means this is bank fraud, wire fraud, and about 10 other kinds of felonies. But here is the kicker." He pulled out a small digital recorder. "I have a contact inside the HOA board, a lady named Mrs. Higgins who got suspicious. She recorded their last executive session." He pressed play, and Sterling's voice filled my kitchen, clear and undeniable. "We don't need Silas to sell. We just need to make his life hell, cut his fences, poison the well, harass him with fines until he breaks. Once he's bankrupt, we pick up the deed for pennies on the dollar." Hearing it out loud, hearing him plan the destruction of my life like he was ordering lunch, made my hands shake, not with fear, but with anticipation. Jax looked at me, his eyes serious. "We have enough to go to the sheriff, but Sterling has judges in his pocket. He might wiggle out on bail and disappear." "No," I said, standing up and looking out the window at Bucky, who was limping around the yard. "We don't just want him arrested. We want him destroyed. We want to burn his little empire to the ground so thoroughly that no one ever tries this again." We hatched a plan, a two-pronged attack. First, we contacted Sarah Jenkins, a shark of a litigator who hated Sterling almost as much as I did, to file a massive countersuit and emergency injunction. Second, we reached out to Rachel Stone, an investigative journalist in Las Vegas known for eating corrupt developers for breakfast, and gave her everything: the recording, the maps, the photos of the poisoned meat, the video of the fake patrol. The court hearing was set for Tuesday, a preliminary injunction regarding the easement dispute, and we knew Sterling would be there, strutting like a peacock, expecting to crush the poor rancher with his high-priced legal team. He had no idea that we weren't bringing a defense, we were bringing an execution. The courtroom in the county seat was freezing, the air conditioning humming aggressively to fight the Nevada heat, but the atmosphere inside was heavy, suffocating. Marcus Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table surrounded by 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than my tractor, looking bored. Checking his watch like this was just another errand before lunch. I sat alone with Sarah Jenkins and Jax, wearing my clean boots and a button-down shirt that felt stiff around the neck, feeling the weight of the digital recorder in Jax's pocket like a loaded weapon. The judge, an older woman named Judge Holloway with eyes sharp enough to cut glass, called the session to order. Sterling's lead attorney stood up, launching into a rehearsed speech about community progress and obstructionist behavior, waving the fake easement papers around like they were holy scripture. He painted me as a crazy hermit, a danger to the peaceful residents of Canyon Creek, demanding the court force me to grant them access to my land. When it was our turn, Sarah didn't make a speech. She simply stood up and said, "Your Honor, we aren't here to argue the validity of an easement, because the easement doesn't exist. We are here to present evidence of a criminal conspiracy." Sterling let out a loud, mocking scoff, but Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Proceed, counselor." Sarah called Jax to the stand. He walked up, calm as a frozen lake, and laid it all out. First, the forensic accounting showing the theft of HOA funds. Then, the forged GIS maps. The color began to drain from Sterling's face, his boredom replaced by a twitchy nervousness as his lawyers started whispering frantically to each other. But when Jax played the recording, when Sterling's voice echoed through the silent courtroom, talking about poisoning the well and bankrupting me, the room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. I watched Sterling shrink, physically shrink, into his chair. He looked at the door, then at his lawyers, realizing there was no spin, no maneuver, no check he could write to fix this. Judge Holloway listened to the tape, her face hardening into stone. She paused the recording, took off her glasses, and looked directly at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, I am revoking your bail on the previous trespassing charges, and I am issuing a bench warrant for immediate arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Bailiff, take him into custody." The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut on Sterling's wrists was the sweetest music I have ever heard. He tried to stammer, tried to threaten, but the deputies hauled him out the side door, his polished shoes scuffing helplessly against the linoleum, a king dragged off his throne. The aftermath was like watching a dam break. Rachel Stone dropped her article that afternoon, and it went viral within hours. The residents of Canyon Creek, realizing they had been robbed blind by their own board president, revolted. The remaining board members resigned in disgrace. The insurance companies canceled their policies, and the entire HOA collapsed under the weight of lawsuits from angry homeowners. A week later, I was out by the fence line, repairing the cedar posts where Bucky had been hurt. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the desert floor, turning the sagebrush into gold. A deputy pulled up, not to harass me, but to hand me an envelope, a court-ordered restitution check from Sterling's frozen assets. It was enough to fix the fence, pay the vet bills 10 times over, and buy enough feed for 5 years. I watched the deputy drive away, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the still air. Bucky was grazing nearby, still limping slightly but strong, alive. Gunner and Rex were resting in the shade, safe. I picked up my shotgun, not because I needed it, but because it felt right to have it close. I looked at the check, then out at the horizon where the lights of the subdivision usually twinkled. Tonight, they seemed dimmer, quieter. Justice is a funny thing. It doesn't fix the sleepless nights, it doesn't unbreak the fence, and it doesn't take away the memory of finding poison in the dirt. But standing there, breathing the clean, cool air of my own land, unbroken and unbought, I realized that sometimes the only way to get peace is to be willing to go to war for it. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? If I hadn't been awake at 5:14 a.m., if I hadn't had the money for a PI, if I hadn't known how to fight back, would Sterling still be sitting in his high-rise, drinking scotch, while my ranch was turned into a parking lot? How many other people out there are losing this fight right now because they don't have a shotgun and a friend like Jack's? I racked the shell out of the chamber, caught it in midair, and slipped it into my pocket. The silence of the desert returned, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like victory.